Hey everybody, first of all, a huge thank you to Container Exchange. I love DCS, I love the idea, I love how well they've managed to gather people over the past couple of years for this event, online or physical, and I'm just really appreciative to be here. Today I want to talk about something that's been on my mind a lot, the subject of innovation, and I really want to make it as non-buzzwordy as possible. I like buzzwords sometimes, but I do want to try to create something that is tangible and has very clear takeaways for companies that aren't tech startups raising money off of buzzwords. So today, I've titled my lecture here today, Innovation Despite or Because of Crises, Thoughts on Jazz, COVID, Capacity, and Innovation, right? There's been a lot of crises recently, and I think that when we zoom forward a decade from now, some of the innovations that are coming as a result of the crises that we're all exposed to right now will continue to be huge advantages. And, the long run, the silver lining today for COVID in general, which seems very, very small, I think the silver lining going forward a decade from now, especially in international freight and logistics, will be simply huge. Now, one important or three important disclaimers that I want to put out there. The first is I'm not an innovation expert. I'm sure that such a thing exists. I'm sure that there's people that know what they're talking about. I'm not an innovation expert, and I'm also not an academic that has studied the entire body of literature around innovation. What I am is somebody who really, really likes freight technology. And I've been watching it carefully for over 7 years now. I've been looking at different parts of trends and trying to deconstruct it. And something popped up for me over the last 3 or 4 months. You may have read it if you subscribe to the Freightos newsletter. Something popped up for me over the past couple of months that I thought was an insight worth sharing with this crowd, which is really pretty gung-ho about how freight and technology can converge in order to do good. So what I am is a freight technology enthusiast, maybe aficionado. My name is Eytan or Eytan Buchman. I go back and forth online, so you might have seen different variations. This is me when I was less into freight and less into technology, but still equally cool. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at the Freightos Group. You may know different parts of the Freightos Group. We operate Freightos.com, which is a digital freight marketplace. We operate Web Cargo, which facilitates digital pricing, booking, and capacity management between carriers, air and ocean. Freight forwarders and also online freight sales tools for freight forwarders. We operate Freightos Data, which provides data insights off of different data that we aggregate and more. I try to make freight sexy. I try to make it really interesting. And I think my credentials for talking about this, besides the fact that I spend a lot of time talking about it and thinking about it, is that what Freightos does really extends across carriers, freight forwarders, and BCOs from multinationals down to tiny one-person businesses, guys living in their parents' basement and selling things on Amazon. And what I see as a result of that is a lot of connectivity between the different pieces that require that companies learn how to adapt their processes to work better with other companies. So where I end up kind of spending a lot of my time is looking at internal processes at companies, and then how do those internal processes map onto other companies? And I promised I'm going to get rid of the buzzwords. So just as a very concrete example, first looking at how does a freight forwarder digitize their own freight prices and the rates that they get, but then more importantly than just getting that internal efficiency, how do they connect to other companies to provide the value from those automated rates? And that's just one example, but to try to make it a little more tangible. And I do want to flag out at that point also that innovation can take place internally at a company and can take place externally. I think cross-company innovation, so innovation that connects different types of companies, is really the holy grail because you end up driving value not just to yourself, but to the ecosystem and to partners, and it helps you differentiate. And we'll get there, I promise. So first, what drives innovation, right? Where does innovation happen? And I promise it's not huge fundraising rounds. That's not where innovation comes from. One of my favorite examples, which I've been talking about a lot recently, I've heard it a bunch on podcasts. I did not make up this example. I've heard it and I'm parroting it back here because it seems salient, is an incredible jazz concert. If you're not into Keith Jarrett, you should be. It doesn't matter what kind of music you like, I promise. There is this epic concert that went on to be one of the best-selling jazz piano albums of all time from Keith Jarrett, who does improv jazz. Keith Jarrett was in the middle of a huge world tour, I think in the year 2 of his world tour, and a young 17-year-old concert promoter who loved jazz, said, I am going to get Keith Jarrett out to Germany for a concert. Now, jazz at the time in Germany was not huge. There was a pretty dedicated fan base, but it wasn't gigantic. The only venue that Vera, the concert organizer, could find was a opera house that guaranteed them an 11 p.m. slot. Despite the time, it was a totally sold out concert. 1,432 seats were totally booked. Everybody was really excited. However, Keith Jarrett was coming off of excruciating back pains from traveling all around. He got to the opera house in order to try it out in the afternoon, and the piano he had requested was not there. Instead, there was a half grand piano that was not tuned. Some of the keys didn't work. He wanted to back out. He thought a lot about it. Last minute decided, okay, fine, I'm going to do this out of a favor to Vera and to the local jazz scene. Did a concert, and it was the concert of a lifetime, despite the fact that the piano was incredibly difficult to operate, and he was missing keys. And as a pianist, I don't play piano, I play guitar. If I was missing a string, I can guarantee you I would not perform. But despite the constraint that was created by that piano, he gave the concert of a lifetime. And, obviously, by now you have picked it up, that just to spell it out, crises can make for really, really good things. When you have the right crisis that drives the right type of change, it can really, really help. Another example, and this is going back into the tech scene, is if you look back at the number of US software companies that raised massive funding rounds, you'll see something interesting happen around the financial crisis, around the 2007, 2008 mark, despite the fact that there was a massive financial crisis. And suddenly companies were not raising money. There were companies that were out there that were getting huge rounds, and some of the largest companies that we know today went out and succeeded during those times. Companies like Airbnb, where constraints about where people could work or constraints about what type of demand there was were enough to shape the right technology companies that suddenly made it relevant. And, Airbnb, I mentioned it before, Airbnb was suddenly a phenomenal solution for people that weren't necessarily flush with cash, or people that still wanted to travel around. So, I think that's another example of the fact that things don't need to be going right in order to come up with new ideas. As a matter of fact, if things are going wrong, it might be a much better way to actually innovate. And Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's chief of staff and the mayor of Chicago, I think has a fantastic line about this, where you never really want a crisis to go to waste. You always want to make sure that you're taking advantage of something that is requiring that you take another look at your business in order to figure out how to innovate. And here again, I want to be really clear. Startups don't have a monopoly on innovation. I hate it when startups talk about technology and how they're driving technology and other companies aren't doing it. I particularly hate it in international freight and logistics because I do not believe that freight is an uninnovative business. I think if you look back to the 70s and to the 80s, freight has always been ahead. EDI right now, some people might laugh at it, but EDI was incredibly groundbreaking, and the degree to which it was accepted by the industry is what allowed the industry to scale so large. So, startups definitely don't have a monopoly on innovation. There might be some people that debate that point. There certainly aren't people that debate the point that startups don't have a monopoly on crises, right? We've all been hit by a lot of different crises recently, COVID especially, and I think that it's an opportunity, and when you look at some of the examples I bring in later on, you'll understand the magnitude of those crises opportunities. So let's talk a little bit about what I'll be discussing over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. The first thing is a value of a crisis. Check, we already did that. We're ahead of schedule, right? We talked about how a crisis can drive serious innovation. The second thing I want to touch on, and this is still a little bit on the theoretical level, is the anatomy of a crisis-driven innovation. So how does innovation actually stem out from crises? It's not just, I have a bad piano, now I'm going to have a really, really good performance. There's things that need to be there in order to affect that change. I also want to bring in 3 very, very specific examples of innovation that have happened or I believe are in the process of happening, and not just related to technology. And then one important slide about where it doesn't work. Just because there is a crisis doesn't mean that innovation will be a necessary byproduct of that crisis. So let's with that, of course, and then we'll end with some wild applause. Unfortunately, I had to pre-record this because I had a pre-existing conflict, but feel free to record an audio of that wild applause and just send it to me. I'm looking forward to getting it. So talking a little bit about the anatomy of a crises-driven innovation. Sometimes things, for example, just aren't timed right. I think to Google Glasses, which I do strongly believe that augmented reality or metaverse depends on where you like to spend your time. I do think that augmented reality is going to be huge. Google Glasses might have been too early. Our CEO actually at Freightos has a similar story where he had a company called Ghost, which was basically a virtual desktop before Freightos or a couple of years before Freightos that didn't succeed because the timing might not have been right, despite any crises that might happen with needing to access product files somewhere else. So what are the 4 steps of the crisis-driven innovation that I want to discuss today? The first is a trigger event. You need a crisis to happen. I think that's really, really clear. You need something that unseats what's going on, something that knocks you back a little bit and makes you rethink. You need to have a financial crisis, or you need to have a piano that doesn't work particularly well. The second thing that you need is you need that trigger event, that crisis, to impact the status quo in a very particular way. And that's something that we're going to unpack soon because I think it justifies a little bit more time spent. The third thing that you need once the status quo is changed is the ability to actually change the way a company or person is behaving, right? So you have the trigger event, getting punched in the face. You have being ready somehow or susceptible to change the status quo. Then you need to affect that change. And then something that I think some companies ignore or miss is you need to have the right framework to actually accept that change. You need to be ready to take whatever change was implemented, stick through with it, and make sure that that innovation is given fair chance in order to make sure that it can become part of your regular toolkit. So I said 2 things that we're going to unpack. We're going to unpack that how the trigger actually changes the status quo, and we're going to unpack a little bit about how something can stick. So when it comes to the trigger matching the status quo, something cool that I unearthed while I was researching for this presentation is Play-Doh. Play-Doh is kind of toy clay, if you're not familiar with it. I think it's the most popular version of it. In some countries, they call it plastilina. So Play-Doh actually in the 1920s and 30s was used to clean coal stains off of walls. Of course, in the 1930s, suddenly people stopped using coal nearly as much and started to use electric power instead. Now that's a crisis for the Play-Doh industry, right? Because suddenly something is changing. Their status quo was we were providing services to the coal cleaning industry or to house cleaning. Suddenly there's a massive crisis that hits, and the option that was safe of sticking to cleaning suddenly is no longer the safe. As a matter of fact, it is safer to try a new type of innovation. So I think that's one example of innovation that can take place when the safe option is no longer out there. The second option of innovation, or the way that the status quo can be changed, is a new opportunity can be created. So the crisis for the video industry became very, very real once people started to stream things online, right? Suddenly there's this whole new area out there. And this is certainly a crisis for Blockbuster, of course, but that crisis of an industry that suddenly has all these new ideas and new potentials, but is struggling a lot with piracy and is struggling a lot with fragmentation. You have your cinemas, you have streaming online, you have downloading from Napster or LimeWire or Kazaa, wherever those found you. You have new opportunities that are created, and sometimes you just need to open up your eyes and see those new opportunities. I think Netflix was a great example. We don't all remember, but they started out by sending DVDs out. And suddenly when they realized that there's all this opportunities online, they switched over to using bandwidth, which suddenly became available and started streaming online instead. Another really good example was the Marvel world. If you're a fan of comic books, Marvel, their entire empire had been crumbling in the early 2000s. People were not reading comic books as much. Digital consumption was going up much more. And now it seems like these come out every single month. But action hero or comic book hero movies were not always a thing. And in 2008, Marvel launched Iron Man, right? The safer opportunity of sticking with what they had just wasn't available. They couldn't rely on comic books. And instead, they became increasingly awareness of a shift in media consumption. The crises of nobody is buying our comic books made them look out, see some new opportunities that were out there, and switch over into movie franchises, which obviously have been massively successful. So again, you can have a crisis, but it needs to change the status quo in a way that creates the right opportunities for innovation. The second thing that we need is to get it to stick, right? It's not enough to have that innovation. And there's a laundry list of different things that can impact it. You need to have the right company culture set up in place in advance in order to make innovation work. Otherwise, everybody becomes risk averse, and in the long run, being risk averse is the most risky type of business that you could have. The second thing that you need to have is you need to have a very clear idea of what are your existing assets, because you never know which part of your assets you're going to want to use and which parts you're going to want to shed. You also need to make sure that you can combat risk averseness with stakeholder support. There needs to be full buy-in across the executive suite down to the people that are actually implementing it. If the people on the ground don't believe in it, but the senior staff management do, it won't work. If senior management don't believe in it, but the people on the ground do, it won't work either. And I have examples of both of those where it took off successfully. Finally, you either need those crises conditions to persist, or you need to see that ROI and see the potential early enough to make sure that it sticks afterwards. And of course, you need luck, and you need a lot of luck. There's a lot of different types of innovation that have happened that were just poor timing, and then they don't stick. So we've talked a little bit more than I anticipated about the academics. Let's talk about 3 examples of freight, because that's why we're all here, right? One of my favorite examples to talk about recently is Maersk, and I just have to give a massive shout out. I have a lot of respect for what's happened there. And I think, right now, especially in 2021, Q3, Q4, on our mind are $22,000 Trans-Pacific container prices from China to the United States. But it wasn't so long ago, just 5 years ago, that there were massive crises conditions for the ocean freight industry, right? Remember Hanjin, just 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago from when I'm recording this, Hanjin went bankrupt because ocean prices were so low. So collapsing freight rates in 2015 and 16 were crushing Maersk. It was an incredibly difficult situation. In addition, Maersk also had a very large energy business, and low oil prices at the time were causing billions of dollars of losses. Right? So, as I said, $2 billion of losses. Now, when you have that crisis, it has to hit the status quo. And the status quo very clearly meant business as usual was going to be more expensive and more dangerous than any shift possibly could. The energy business was losing money, the ocean freight sector was losing money, and something needed to change. And here is my first mark of respect for Maersk, where in order to lift your head up out of the water enough to say, hey, something's wrong and something's got to change, that takes dedication, determination, and a certain amount of self-awareness, which they pulled off very well. So on June 23rd, they had an executive meeting, and they walked out from that meeting with a change. A very well-articulated strategy, which would basically say, we are going to split off our energy business. We're going to roll it out into a separate business and rid ourselves of the distraction that that's creating. 2 separate business units makes for a very, very difficult solution. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to double down on transport and logistics. And Maersk at that time, 17-18% market share of container freight, largest ocean liner in the world, had, I think, 4 core assets that they were able to articulate. The first is control of supply. They wanted to get into transport and logistics, but they also had the largest container fleet ship in the world. In addition, a ton of data that they were able to wrap together and put together to create new solutions, a huge customer base, and by selling the energy business, a lot of capital. And together that rolled out into a new strategy, which I think was articulated and rolled out particularly well, making sure that stakeholders understood it, every single person within the company understood it. I think one of my favorite manifestations of that strategy is from a 2019 annual report where they articulated it as the foundation of Maersk's strategy is superior delivery network end-to-end, which delivers on fundamental needs for getting goods to the right place at the right time, at the right price with minimum environmental impact. And that's a very, very clear strategy change from this very, very broad business. I think the biggest part of the strategy for us within the freight sector is end-to-end rather than just doing the container freight. Now, when I look at the innovation that happened, and just to recap, crisis of poor market conditions, the change within the status quo, which is business as usual, becomes more expensive, and now an actual change. And I think the actual change was, how do we go to end-to-end international freight, and how do we dominate it? I personally, when I did some research about this, broke this down into 4 different areas. So in their core business, they focused on how do we make our container fleet more effective and how do we start pushing out a little bit more into freight forwarding. Then they started to build up this second circle of their forwarding businesses, through internal capacity buildup, like Hamburg Süd acquisition and rolling Damco in, some investments afterwards in digital freight forwarders, building up their own fleet. Building up their own internal freight forwarder. And then afterwards, starting to work on a value added service in order to complement their existing international freight, things like trade financing, temperature control, and better online platforms for booking trucking or for acquiring fruit or sourcing products. So together, what they ended up doing, and this is not an example of small kind of renegade innovation, it's fundamental, let's break this down and build it back up innovation of building up this very, very large platform across Maersk. Now, the stick is that I think the jury is still a little bit out, but it meant that Maersk was uniquely positioned to capitalize on the freight rate crisis. It gave them SMB capabilities that a lot of large ocean liners don't necessarily have. It gave them focus that everybody within the company knew exactly what they're working on. And when I speak to Maersk employees, this comes up again and again. And it gave them a very strong venture growth arm that gave them the ability not just to innovate when they made that change, but continue to innovate and stay farther ahead. And it finally gave them broader integration capabilities to work with different companies in different facilities. So, just to wrap up that example, in this case, innovation is basically seeing how conditions change and making a nuts and bolts change to their core strategy in order to address it. And I think if you look at their shareholder reports, but I think more so when you speak to Maersk employees, you really get the sense that it reinvigorated the business, and they're on a very, very strong trajectory with a lot of very strategic acquisitions as well. Let's take a shift over from ocean to air for a second and talk a little bit about digital air cargo booking. So, talking about the crisis, I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is available cargo ton kilometers pre-COVID and right after COVID hit. And of course, we all know that belly cargo availability just dropped off of a cliff as soon as COVID hit. Passenger flights were not traveling around. People needed to ship more than they ever needed to ship before, right? PPE, medical, e-commerce taking off, but there just wasn't enough capacity around. And the status quo, and I'm talking specifically here about Air France KLM, just because I had a fascinating conversation a while back with their VP Customer Distribution and Service, and it's really stuck with me, is that the status quo that Air France KLM was at the point was they were changing. They were already in the midst of a change where we needed more digitization. They knew, and I think many people that are listening in on this have already identified digitization as a need, but suddenly that huge demand for capacity, together with the fact that people were working from home, created a massive crisis for every airline company out there. There was a lot of demand. They needed to fill it. They needed to create more supply, and they needed to empower their workforce to address the demands from their customer base. And here, I think the status quo was already a small shift that was happening, but that needed to move forward much, much faster. Right? But on the background, air cargo has always been a neglected baby brother of passenger travel, right? Usually representing only about 20% of revenue compared to 80% of passenger. They were using a lot of rate sheets. Every airline was sending out these periodic rate sheets that obviously couldn't adapt fast enough to the fast-paced environment of COVID. There was epic back and forth between between the shippers and the freight forwarders and the airlines to find the space. And sometimes by the time space was secured, the price was no longer relevant. And finally, it was very relationship dependent, which means you need to talk to somebody, which is very difficult when everybody's working from home or not necessarily available because of COVID. So I think the biggest change here is online booking, moving over to digitizing capacity, distributing it online through a variety of channels. What this required was internal business discipline. This has been my favorite talking point from my Air France KLM conversation, which is, I think the most brilliant insight is no salesperson can be able to provide a price that isn't available on a website. Now that's a huge shift. Imagine saying that to your salesperson and how they would respond. That shift of saying we are always going to provide the same price is business discipline 101. The second change that they made was external connectivity, was taking internal rates that they had and internal APIs that they had and providing it to third-party platforms like Freightos Web Cargo. The third thing is experimentation, a change of, hey, what happens if we? And I have a really good example of that. I'll bring it up in a second, of how Air France KLM was willing to take that idea and make a change of there's a crisis of communications. and experiment with it. Now, where it's stuck, what Robert had told me at the time was our distribution strategy is based on the principle that you want to be where your customer is. And that's where it ended up sticking. They had back-end digitization that was there that they ended up exposing externally. They had pre-existing business agility, like I mentioned before, and they created a positive reinforcement loop from ROI. What is that ROI? Between January 2018 and June 2020, the number of bookings made digitally changed from 8% to 43%. That is a huge business shift. Now, the ROI that you get from that is massive, and that's enough to keep the circle going, the stick going, right? The innovation sticking, so you can keep on, so that you keep on innovating. There's another great example. I mentioned this before about communications. Air France KLM came up with a new concept called Kick Charter. There were so many people that were looking to charter planes that in just 2 or 3 weeks, they developed a new platform to provide auctions online for charters. And already towards the end of 2020, Robert mentioned to me that they had sold more charters through Kick Charter than they did through their phone system. And again, that is dependent on that back-end digitization already being there. It was dependent on having that business agility, and it was dependent on having a positive reinforcement loop. But all three of those things together meant that once the innovation was there, it could prove itself and it could stick. And on the industry level, this also proved itself. This is a chart of the percentage growth of e-bookings across the industry. It wasn't only Air France KLM, but I do need to call them out for being incredibly receptive about it. And you can see even until September, these numbers are just going through the roof. One last example, going back to ocean freight. This one is still in the process of kind of shaking itself out, but ocean bills of lading, I think, is something that we all know, right? Historically, in the lore, there's courier express companies that made their first big bucks on flying out bills of lading in order to release goods faster. Now, what was the crisis? The crisis is that COVID, plus the fact that you have to touch physical documents, just right? You can get COVID from it. There were fewer people that were working at the ports in order to accept documents, and suddenly people needed to ship more than ever, and certainly today and later on. And that caused a real crisis for a lot of companies. Like, how do we keep this going? And how do we keep on working efficiently during the course of COVID? Luckily enough, this was something that I think also was not born in COVID, but was certainly accelerated by COVID. E-booking, the bills of lading have always been a little bit unsustainable, creating a massive amount of paper and complications. But suddenly, in some cases, it went from unsustainable to impossible. So the status quo was hit, right? Suddenly, it was riskier not to start experimenting with these things. The ocean industry might not have been the people that were feeling it as much as governments that were trying to adapt to new changes and new policies. I think that kind of unlocked some new opportunities where historical stakeholders that were opposed to changes were suddenly open to new changes. The status quo before the change goes in is that it really is hard to change these fundamentals. If you look at air AWBs, after over 10 years, they're still only at 70% traction. There's a lot of fragmentation of the bill of lading of dependence. Right, this is like a big change for the industry, but the change still happened. And I chalk that change up to DCSA, which I think does a fantastic job with standardization. This strong push that happened over the past couple of years with large customers like banks, ports, and other shippers in order to push for the change, and internal assets that the carriers were allocating towards creating this. And I have a very interesting conversation I had with Andre Simha from MSC who talked about this back-end process. I'm happy to share it if anyone wants to reach out after this. But the crisis that happened was suddenly you can't do the same paper trail that you always could do. The status quo was that for some of the core stakeholders, not changing was going to be more expensive than changing. And it hit an environment that was already ripe for this because people had started to think about this from a standardization perspective and getting stakeholder support over the past couple of years. Andre was kind enough from MSC was kind enough to share some data that between August 2020 and August 2021, there was a 10% growth of digital bills of lading usage, which is massive for such a nascent technology. In terms of the long-term result, I think the jury is still out. I think this was a positive reinforcement of the potential, and you'll probably reach a tipping point at some point where it just becomes massively more efficient. But this is a very good example of how innovation was lurking around the surface, but that crisis might have been enough to pull it out and give it a little bit of a boost. Now, one last slide of where things can go wrong. So even if you have that crisis, if there is a safe fallback that appears, that innovation can get hamstringed. Innovation teams, ironically, in my experience, can sometimes stop innovation. They don't necessarily have the full buy-in, or they work on too many different projects, or they end up chasing the wrong innovation. There's kind of a popular thought within a lot of tech companies or startups that they hate working with corporate innovation teams. There's, of course, exceptions, some fantastic innovation teams out there, but sometimes innovation teams, particularly if they aren't given the teeth and are just given the title, can really hamstring innovation. Lacking skills. You can't turn around and suddenly start innovating. If you think to the tech companies that innovated during the financial crisis, they were all people with strong skills. If you think about Maersk leveraging its internal assets, you can think about Air France-KLM that already had the business agility and already had the back-end digitization. You could think about bills of lading and what went into the background before the crisis hit. You need to start working that muscle so that when you need to do that big lift, when you need to start innovating, you're ready for it. And finally, too radical can sometimes be a problem. If you try to innovate too much, then changing too much can be too difficult for an organization and can really rip it apart. This is the point where I get to shamelessly advertise a little bit about freighters or web cargo. If you're a freight forwarder or a carrier, strongly suggest you checking out web cargo. Web cargo has really emerged during the course of COVID as the best platform for digital bookings. From an air cargo perspective, we have more capacity and airlines digitized than any other company in the world by far, doing a good job at working our way through ocean freight as well. So check it out. It's free to register for freight forwarders at webcargo.co. And yeah, maybe let's go out and hope for a crisis that kind of sparks a little bit of innovation. And of course, if you have questions, if you want to discuss this, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love talking about this stuff. Again, I'm Eytan Buchman from Freightos. Container Exchange, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really look forward to hearing thoughts from everybody. Have a great week.